Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Unvarnished Football. I'm Michael Jackson of the Game Before the Money, and with me is Upton Bell. Upton, former director of player personnel for the Colts, former general manager for the Patriots, former World Football League owner of the Charlotte Hornets. And we're going to talk about post-career injuries, specifically brain injuries, after Roger Craig announcing he has vascular dementia during his Pro Football Hall of Fame induction speech. And then also Chris Johnson, great Titans running back, has ALS. Okay, and these are conditions that football players are getting after their careers, and it seems to be at a higher rate, and we'll go into that higher rate a little bit later in the show. Upton, what was your first thought when you heard Roger Craig disclosing his condition?
Well, first of all, Michael, I thought something strange here because every Hall of Fame induction ceremony I ever watched, it was which is now a prepared speech that you read off a teleprompter, or just off the cuff, which is the way I learned starting in 1971 when I was a presenter. Guys just got up there and said what came to them and the feelings from their heart about this day. Now it's cut and dried. You have the pre-introduction, and then the player talks, and you can tell it's from a teleprompter. In this case, it's the first time I can remember that they said, "Well, Roger Craig is we were told he's not going to speak. It's going to be on video." So we go through the whole video. It was very moving to a degree, and I kept saying to myself, why is he not talking directly like everybody else did to the public? This is his day. But we find out why. Because he says in the middle of it that he really has, he's got a debilitating disease. And I'm saying to myself, well, this had to come from the constant hits that you can see in the games as they're kind of showing him in all different parts of his career and how he ran high up, and his style was completely different, but the constant putting his head down and banging. And now we find out why this is happening and why he's speaking, through a video. And I tell you what, everybody was shocked. I know I was shocked.
I looked into vascular dementia, which is what he has. I looked into that, various sites like the Mayo Clinic, Alzheimer's.gov, and it has something to do with damage to the blood vessels in the brain. Often it happens after a stroke, but it comes from blood vessels being damaged in the head, and that obviously lines up with football and taking so many hits to the head. With someone like Roger Craig, if you remember him running with his head down, like he said, he took a lot of punishment. And, he said football has given me a lot, but football has taken away too. And that's kind of something that we've seen consistently in a lot of ways with players. All the former players that I know, which are many, all of them have some kind of debilitating physical issue. Be it, their hands might be deformed, they can't lift their shoulders up. Remember in the Sports Illustrated article that we've talked about, Johnny Unitas couldn't comb his own hair. He had struggled with that and brushing his teeth.
Jim Otto.
Jim Otto. Yes, exactly. And the list goes on and on. And when you think about players that, and those are the stars of the game, and then there are players who aren't very well known, who were the journeymen, and they're going through the same things. And I've said this before on both the Game Before the Money and this show, I think. I know of one Hall of Famer whose wife continues to keep working to maintain insurance for them to make sure his medical costs are covered. So these are things that are not covered by the NFL after.
It's it's awful. John Mackey's wife, who died of CTE, and didn't really know who he was for a long time. And I knew John very well. Handsome guy, looked like he's on his way to Hollywood. I mean, you name it, head of the Players Association. And a guy that you say, boy, he is in the middle of a great part of his life. He's now retired as a Colt, and then we find this out. How many times Sylvia Mackey, his wife, went to the NFL, and the same way with Unitas, who was really essentially ended up being a cripple, and the NFL, because of their rules and everything, kind of denied it. Sylvia Mackey was a flight attendant. If you can imagine this, just to keep being able to pay the bills. That's awful. There is something wrong with the NFL. They spend millions. I mean, Jerry Jones' team was valued at $15.5 billion. These are all billionaires and people who can afford to do this, and yet they fight tooth and nail still with the Players Association over things like this. Now, it was worse then when it happened to Mackey and Jim Otto and people like that. But it is a contact sport. It has always been a contact sport. I think it's more dangerous to play today because of the size and speed and the hitting ability of the players versus back when I first started to watch it in the 40s, in the early 40s. The helmets, when they went from the leather helmets, even though they say they're more protective today, to really the plastic helmets, that changed the way guys got the disease and what happened to them, although we will never know totally how many really suffered from it, but it appeared to be a lot less. So when I see what's happened and what continues to happen, the billions that are made by these teams and the prices that these owners can exact for selling their teams, and I say to myself, why can't we take care of the people who actually made this game great? It's a disgrace, Michael.
And that's why there are groups such as Mike Ditka's Gridiron Greats that collect money, that raise money to help former players out. Because, a lot of them, I remember Conrad Dobler when I was talking to him, and I interviewed him for the book, The Game Before the Money. He told me the amount of money that he spent on medical bills, operations related to his career, far outweighed the amount of money that he made. Now, players today are making a considerable amount higher than what Conrad Dobler made in the 70s. But at the same time, these players are going to have to incur medical costs well beyond their years. And you might be thinking like, well, Aaron Rodgers just signed a whatever $1 million contract. Look at Patrick Mahomes. Look at the money he's making. Look at how much money Tyreek Hill's making. Sure, or has made, Tyreek Hill. Sure, they've made a lot of money. But most players who play in the NFL, they play for 3.5 years. We've talked about this before. And the amount of contracts that they're signing they're not making millions of dollars. A lot of them are making the league minimum, 400,000 in that area per year. Now you've got to live your life off of the rest of that. Perhaps if you incur some sort of debilitating injury, that's what we're talking about here. There are a lot of people who are caught in the middle who have shorter careers and they're still having these same kinds of medical issues. And those are the people who are really caught in situations that are really difficult to manage.
Well, the thing is that the NFL, and you can see it. There was somebody contacted me about a week ago and said this fight continues between what the players think they deserve medically and what the league is willing to do. There are all sorts of suits back and forth still now when the league is making more money than it's ever made before. And you're absolutely right. 3.5 to 4 years if you're lucky, if you're a player. Now just think about all of the different situations, no matter how much a player made in his lifetime. That basically for the rest of his life, he will be fighting CTE, all sorts of brain and different injuries. So you say to yourself, well, let's say his career is over, the great ones that play maybe luckily into their late 30s, if they're lucky to do that. What about the rest of their lives? How painful and how bad can the rest of their lives be? And of course, you can say, well, that was their choice. They decided that they wanted to play and this and that. But think about it. Think about the rest of your... I would not, as much as I like, let's say, what I'm doing, if somebody said to me, well, you can do that, make yourself a lot of money, but you're going to be sick for the last portion, let's say the last 40 years of your life, if you're lucky to live that long, I would say, you know what, screw that, I'll find out something else to do. But that isn't what happens with football players, and I find it totally sad.
And in a lot of cases, we're hearing from former players that they wouldn't allow, if they had the choice, they wouldn't allow their descendants to play football.
A lot of them have said that. Terry Bradshaw said it. I don't know how many have said that.
I think
yes.
Mike Ditka has said that as well.
And look at all the leading personalities that have said that. But you know what? It's too late for Roger Craig. I wonder what, no matter how much you love something, think about the rest of his life. How many years he's going to live? He might have a much shorter life because of all of this. But think about the moments when he's alone with his wife and he's looking at, essentially, he's got a death sentence. That's what it is.
And all the former players that I know, to a man, every single one of them has some sort of concern about it. Like, is that going to happen to me? Am I going to be on that list that so many of my peers are on? I can't tell you how many players have mentioned that to me, that concern. And I think that you've probably had similar experiences with people talking to you.
So many. How about Jim Tyre? That you know what? Walked in and murdered his wife and his children. I mean, there was a first ballot Hall of Famer, probably one of the greatest tackles I've ever watched play. And what did he do? And they suspect, at that time they couldn't prove certain things, but they suspect that he had CTE. and that his brain was going. I mean, how could somebody go in and murder his own wife and his children? That is so stark and so awful. But it points out the downside. And you know what? Everybody's talked, because I had a discussion with a group about it, who talked about he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, but the Hall of Fame wants no part of it. And the voters don't want any part of it, because they're saying, are we going to put in somebody who murdered his wife and his children? And that's a bad look for the Hall of Fame. So I understand, and I'm not laughing, but I understand the reasons why. But think about how awful that story is.
And it's not consolidated just to that one incident. And in fact, there are quite a few players who have committed suicide that are exactly Junior Seau, that are related ostensibly to their brain injuries. Dave Duerson was another. And so we love football, and we love football on Sunday, and we're not trying to be a Debbie Downer here, but the reality of it, this stuff is real, and the guys that we love, the guys that play this game, and we tend to love the guys who play the game at the highest level, who are the grittiest players, who are the toughest players. And a lot of times those are the guys who are most susceptible to this sort of thing because of the way they play the game and the way they use their head and the way they hit, or the way they go in as offensive players, the way that they go into hits and they don't shy away from them. And those sometimes are the players who are most vulnerable to it. I know definitely the guys who are playing in the middle, the centers, the middle linebackers.
They get hit every play.
They get hit every play. Exactly.
And you're using your head much of the time. But again, going back to the 40s and 50s, even into the early 60s, before you really got, the different helmets when it was all leather. I mean, I was a presenter in 1971 and we talked about it last week, for Bill Hewitt, one of the last players, if not the last player, to play without a helmet. And he died ironically in a car accident, but ironically, he never, as far as people knew at that time, he never had any problem with his brain or injury or getting hit or anything like that. Now, that's back in the 30s versus today, but I always claim part of the problem started when they stopped the leather helmets, and of course it's part of progress, and I totally understand that, and went to a different type of helmet, which you still have to a degree today. Now, you notice, and because I'm watching all the training camps on my 3 TVs, every player practically now has those big inflated foam things over top of their own helmet. That's what they're wearing now. And so they recognize the danger of it, because what started out, 4 or 5 years ago as occasionally guys having them on, they all now have these protective helmets they wear in training camp.
The Guardian caps, yes.
The Guardian caps. But again, they went through a whole thing in the paper today on how training camps have totally changed. And you and I have discussed this also. When it used to be, you scrimmage maybe twice a day. You always were in pads. You always had one-on-one drills, guys hitting each other all the time. Now, the rules, and there was a whole thing again today on how the NFL has even become more stringent about training camps. And even with that, guys are getting injured, and some seriously, because sooner or later you have to hit. And that they're now really curtailing to the point of you can only practice twice a day on certain days. You can only hit on certain days. Every Tonight the Patriots are playing the Colts in a preseason game. The quarterback, none of your starters are really going to be playing. The fans uh, pay full price and get suckered in to watch. Really, it's not even an exhibition game. It's an inter squad scrimmage. So who are you going to see? You're not going to see anybody. That's how the NFL has looked at it now, because they know their problem, but their problem is not ever going to go away.
Unless they find a way to solve it. Now, people are putting a lot of research into trying to mitigate concussions and brain injuries. We're not really going to know the results of the steps that people have taken for a number of years, 10, 20, 30 years. Who knows? Who knows how long it will be? But you mentioned earlier the switch from leather helmets to plastic helmets, and I know it sounds crazy, but I have heard when I would talk to a few of the guys who played during the leather era, I know some guys who had said that they preferred the leather helmets. I also, George Talafero, great
Yep.
player for the Colts and a number of teams, and Sonny Jurgensen, Hall of Famer. They both were like, hey, you know what the real problem here is the face mask. Because once they brought the face masks in, then players felt invincible. Before, you couldn't just run up on a guy
And grab them.
and go full force and hit head to head without worrying about busting up your own face. And now with the face mask, and especially these super face masks that they have with the, you got the plexiglass over the eyes, you've got, full on protection, almost like a space helmet, that there isn't any consequence. You're not going to knock your teeth out. You're not going to break your nose. You can go full on into a guy, and that's going to raise both the potential for your own head injury and for your opponents as well. So what have you seen in terms of the face mask, and what's your take on what they had said? And have you heard other players talk?
Well, let me start in the
too?
50s. Let me start in the 50s when my father, who Bert Bell, commissioner of the NFL, called Paul Brown and told him to cut out. He did not want that bar, that single bar that Brown. Brown was such an innovator, not only about the football part of it, but the helmets and the way the equipment and the way the game was played. And my father told him that he didn't want people grabbing the face mask and pulling a guy down and breaking his neck. So for a while, he forbid Paul Brown from that single bar that he had across, which was kind of plastic. And of course, things grew up. But I really want to go back to what has really happened. The NFL and the athlete of today is so much quicker, faster, stronger. I'm not sure how much more intelligent, although they'll argue on that part too. But at the speed, and I can see it. I've got an 80-inch set here, and I watch the collisions, and it's almost like I say to myself, sometimes I got to turn away from this. And I'm used to it. I've been on football fields my whole life, so I'm used to the collisions. But the size and speed, the average player, when I started to really watch in the middle 40s, the average size might be 220 pounds, maybe. Now, today, you've got guys almost 400 pounds. Imagine, and they're fast. They were fast then, but not as fast as these guys today. I mean, you're looking at guys that are over 200 pounds that can run a 4.340. I ran in sneakers against some of our players when they were trying to try out. I ran a 4.6, and I was considered a speed merchant. Think about this. a 4.340. Now you put equipment on a guy, and if he's 6 feet or maybe even bigger, think about the collisions. And that's why I believe someday, not in our lifetime, at least not in my lifetime, that you're going to see more of this kind of football that I call tag football. And you see it developing the leagues. Brady and a lot of guys are jumping into it as kind of a financial thing. But is the NFL going to have 10, 20 years from now 500-pound guys that can run, let's say, a 40 in like 4.5 or 4.6? Imagine the collisions. Think of two cars in demolition derbies. Isn't that what we're really watching here?
And as much as the league puts into safety, and they say that they're doing for safety in changing the rules, they also are optimizing the fields, and equipment is also optimized to build that speed. And the training is also optimized to build that strength and to build that mass. And so we've got kind of two things in conflict with one another. Sure, maybe they weren't as big back in the day, and maybe they didn't run as fast, but at the same time, the fields mitigated their speed.
Yeah, well, not only that, Michael, look, there was a real controversy going on here at the Patriots, in that they had to put in the grass field to get the soccer, World Cup soccer here, and then as all these owners do to make an extra buck, they now have gone back to what I call the artificial turf, which is really basically on crushed stone. Used to be on cement, but then the one of the people, one of the companies, put down the wrong thing, and now they've had to rip that up and get a new thing in time for tonight's first exhibition game. I still call it an exhibition game. They call it preseason. But look what's going on here. Players are still falling on a form of cement. They are getting more injuries. And what is the reason why? Because the NFL owners, they say that they have a certain turf that they now approve, but really you're still playing on a form of AstroTurf, and it's not good. It's been proven it's not good, and I don't understand why the Players Association don't just say to the owners, we are not going to play unless we play on some type of grass surface. But they haven't done that.
And that's an interesting point as well. And as you talk about the turf not meeting the standards, they had to tear it up. These are all things that are being dealt with by players. Their practice is interrupted. They have all kinds of things that they have to adjust to. And these surfaces may not be as safe as grass. In fact, it's been proven that grass is the safest out of all of that. And in terms of major injuries, the artificial turf, especially with knees and ankles, are going to be a lot more.
Well, they not only that, Ben Bolin of the Boston Globe, their chief football writer, wrote a column just yesterday about in spite of all of the precautions that the NFL put in at training camp in the preseason, many players already are finished for the season because of injuries that they've gotten already in training camp, or even running in some of the stadiums, even though most of the games won't start till this weekend. But already some key players that teams have paid like a small fortune to are already out for the season. This is in training camp. I can't remember. And again, I'm not saying, and I want to be very clear to our audience, I'm not saying in my day it was better than today. I'm just making a comparison to what it was like then and what it is like now. I can't remember, uh, you know, teams played 6 games, the 6 exhibition preseason games. Players played kind of themselves into shape. They weren't overtrained. They play a half maybe in the first 3 or 4 games, and then by the last game of the preseason, they play almost the full game. And of course, I remember the coach Reed Eubank and then later Shula say, "Now wait a minute, boys, you got to go at it. Get ready for the season. This is in the final game, but don't get hurt out there," which is really hilarious. But again, what they were doing, and yes, the size and speed, nothing like today, is they were slowly but surely working their way into it. I don't remember, not one time do I remember in the 10 years I was with the Colts under both Reed Eubank and Don Shula. I can't remember really anything happening in the preseason that really was that dangerous. Unitas was one that you could see he was getting a sore arm, and it really happened once we got into the season. And certainly he was the most important. But I don't remember any crucial key injuries, including I would read the different reports coming in from around the league. I don't remember somebody saying, "Oh, the Chicago Bears' Dick Butkus is gone for the season." Now it's almost pedestrian. This is what's going on.
And in terms of concussions and the artificial turf, getting back to that, just kind of summing this up, actually, the concussions on the artificial surface with the cement underneath, that, if in terms of hitting the turf, that is a much more dangerous situation than grass. The only time I've really heard of a player hitting his head on the ground on grass and having a concussion just solely from that collision, Boyd Dowler, and that was at the end of the Ice Bowl, in the last drive of the Ice Bowl. So that turf was frozen solid, much like the artificial turf that they play on today. Now, all of you listening, if you missed it a couple of weeks ago, Upton and I, we had an episode called NFL Grass versus Turf. And if you want to hear more about us discussing that and getting more into that, you can find that and all previous episodes of Unvarnished Football at unvarnishedfootball.com. Now, Chris Johnson, another former NFL star, another great running back, potential Hall of Famer, probably borderline. He came out with the news just a little bit ago that he has ALS.
Yeah.
That is another disease that football players are prone to. In fact, I just read on the NFL alumni website today that pro football players are 4 times more likely to develop ALS than other members of the male population. And the male population is more susceptible to ALS than the female population. So ALS is another threat to players' health. Chris Johnson, in his situation, you might remember Dwight Clark also passed away from ALS. So this is another disease that pro football players are encountering at a higher rate than other people in the population. Upton, how many players do you remember developing ALS from your time?
The medical part of it was, wasn't quite what it is today. But again, I don't remember any from ALS, and I remember very few if any, to a degree, that died of a disease due to constant hits.
Well,
Maybe,
now in
maybe, maybe, maybe they did. I know, like Chuck Bednarik, I'm very close with his brother-in-law, and we talked a lot about Chuck. And of course, Chuck was the last of the 60 Minutemen, played both ways, you know, ended his career with a plastic helmet, but he lived into his 80s, and you know, he would be very forgetful at times and things like that. But there's a guy that had a pretty damn good life after it was over, and he was in the middle. He was getting hit as a center. You know, the centers, they beat the hell out of them, as we talked earlier. And then as a linebacker, it was a completely different game. You stuck your head. They taught you. They teach you in tackling to stick your head in there. I can remember hearing the coaches, some of the assistant coaches at Cold Camp say, "For Christ's sake, so and so, stick your head in there. You got to get used to sticking it." I'll go to my grave remembering, "Hey, stick your head in there, Upton." But that's the way it was. Now it's hard to prove because you know, people like I remember running into Steve Van Buren, who was in his 80s, and was Jim Brown before Jim Brown, one of the greatest running backs of any era, in the Hall of Fame already. I mean, I think he was close to 90 before he died. He used to go to the racetrack every day. I remember running into him at the dedication for my father and he and some other ex-Eagles at an Eagles game. I mean, you would think it was the same Van Brocklin or same Van Buren that I knew back in the 40s. I said, "Jesus, Steve, you're looking good. You're feeling good." He said, "I'm fine." So how do you know? You don't know, but there is definitely a difference between then and now, physically and mentally.
yes, and we want to stress this. This isn't something that happens to every football player. It just happens at a higher rate than it does in the general population. Now, Upton, talking about talking about ALS again, and people getting it in earlier times. There was a really well-known player for Washington and later the Rams, who's really a guy who could be in the Hall of Fame and definitely would be in the Hall of Fame had something like this happened in today's game. But Gene Brito for Washington, he actually developed ALS during his playing career. And Gene Brito, if you want to know how good of a player Gene Brito was, in doing a little bit of research, he's the only player I know of who is the favorite player of three presidents. President Truman, President Kennedy, and President Nixon all listed him as their favorite player. Nixon even lobbied to get Gene Brito in the Hall of Fame. Gene Brito is not in the Hall of Fame right now, but he had to leave football because he developed ALS during his career, and he died in his 30s at a time that he still would be playing. Now, and that was in the mid-60s. Upton, you were working for the Colts then. Do you have memory of that now?
Well, but I actually saw him play when he played against the Eagles in the 50s. And I can remember sitting next to, the box was next to George Preston Marshall's box. And all George Preston Marshall wanted to do was he had a rudder between his box and the bench. And his two things that he always said. He said, I want to make sure that goddamn Redskin band is playing the way I want it to play. And then he would say, and make sure that Gene Brito is always playing. That you send these messages to the bench, and I'm saying to myself, holy Christ, this is unbelievable, watching this whole thing. So I saw Brito play. I will also tell you, in person, he was really a handsome guy. I mean, and a very, very nice guy. Everybody kind of liked him. And it is truly tragic, as we saw with Lou Gehrig, who really made the disease really famous. But we're back to then what would happen to a player, and now what can happen to a player. And if I'm looking at, if I'm sitting down, let's say with my doctor 30 years ago, and if he told me today I would have certain diseases, but those diseases would be coming from the things that I did, whether it was drinking or whatever it was, I probably then would say, I'll worry about it when I'm 60 or something like that. But realistically, if you look at it, when you sign your contract today, and luckily you're at a young enough age, it's the old bromide. Why do we send young men to war? Because when they get older, they wouldn't go to war. And the same way with the NFL. Why, when you're 19, 20, 21, 22, why do you play the most dangerous game of them all? Because you're 22. If you're 42, do you think you'd be playing this game? Of course not.
So, Upton, looking forward to wrap things up, do you think there are any solutions? I know that Lee Steinberg, the agent, he's working hard towards brain health. He has certainly kind of changed his perception of the violence of the game, as many people have who have been close to the game. And he's trying to find ways to help players who have suffered concussions and who are suffering from brain injuries. I know Jack Youngblood has put a lot into that, the Hall of Famer, into research with concussions. And like I said, every one of these guys that I know who have played, it's a concern. Will that be me? Will that happen? Am I on that list? Upton, what do you see going forward? Are there any solutions? Are there anything that the NFL could do to?
Yes, I'll tell you what they could do, which I recommended years ago, and would never pass muster, and that is have a weight and size limit. You know, you can't be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there'll be 500-pound tight ends, offensive tackles, defensive linemen. Have some form of limit on the size. You can't take the speed away. Either you're fast or you're not. But if you start limiting the size, maybe you limit the violence of the hits from people that are so big. That's the only solution I see, because other than that, it is a contact sport, and there's no way you can get all the helmets you want, you can get as many protective things as you want, all the extra padding, and which, by the way, players wear less padding today than they ever did. But until you limit the size and violence of those hits, I'm sorry, you're only kidding yourself. I say that sadly, because of all the sports, and I've been involved and participated in a lot of them, football is a love that you have to have. It's a brilliant conceived sport, but it's no longer a sport. It's a danger.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for listening to this week's edition of Unvarnished Football. Again, you can check out previous episodes of Unvarnished Football at unvarnishedfootball.com. Don't forget, you can also learn more about Upton at uptonbell.com. You can also visit his collection from the University of Massachusetts online and see some of the artifacts and memorabilia, photos of those that are posted online. And also, don't forget to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com and check out the Game Before the Money podcast. My last two episodes feature Hall of Famer Jerry Kramer from the Green Bay Packers, sharing stories from his life and career. Until next week, everybody, enjoy the first full week of NFL preseason games, and we'll get back with you next week.